Welcome to real and deep love stories where every heartbeat tells the truth the world is too afraid to speak. Here, love isn't perfect. It's powerful. It begins in silence, fights through guilt, breaks through walls, and finally learns to surrender. Each story takes you beyond romance, into the raw, unfiltered emotions of souls that dared to love against every rule. These are stories of connection born in shadows, of hearts that trembled before they found courage, of love that refused to fade even when it was forbidden to shine. If you've ever felt love that scared you, healed you, or changed you, belong here. Because here we don't just tell love stories, we feel them. The first time his eyes met mine, it wasn't supposed to mean anything. Just a quiet moment between two people living under the same roof, bound not by choice, but by circumstance. There was a calmness in the way he carried himself, something grounded and sure, something that felt safe in a world that often felt uncertain. At first, it was easy to call it comfort, that simple, gentle awareness of his presence. But comfort has a strange way of deepening, of slipping through the cracks of reason until it becomes something that words can no longer explain. He never looked at me with intent, at least not in the beginning. His gaze was respectful, tender even, as though he feared to trespass into thoughts not meant to be his. But sometimes, late in the quiet hum of evening, when the rest of the world seemed far away, those glances lingered a little too long. There was warmth there, not the kind that burns, but the kind that seeps slowly beneath the skin, unnoticed until it's already part of you. Days moved quietly, but something inside them shifted. There were small things, the way his voice softened when he spoke, the way laughter found its way back into the walls that had forgotten how to echo it. Every shared meal, every fleeting conversation carried an invisible thread, drawing two hearts closer in ways neither dared to acknowledge. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. But the heart doesn't wait for permission. It simply learns to beat differently. There were moments when silence spoke louder than words. Sitting across from him at the table, the sound of a spoon stirring tea became more than a sound. It was rhythm, a pulse. The air between us grew heavier, not with discomfort, but with something that demanded to be felt. It wasn't love yet, not entirely, but it was something dangerously close, a slow, aching awareness that this connection, though quiet, was alive. He carried a sadness in his eyes that no one else seemed to see. It wasn't the kind that came from loneliness, but from years of holding too much inside. And maybe that's where it began, not in attraction, but in recognition. Two souls both searching for understanding in a house where love was meant to have boundaries. It's strange how care can grow roots in forbidden soil. He would ask if everything was all right in that calm, steady way of his, and for reasons that couldn't be explained, those words always felt like more than concern. They felt like a promise that no matter what the world saw, there was someone quietly willing to stay. Nights became longer, not because of time, but because of thought. His laughter would linger in the mind long after it faded from the room. His presence haunted the edges of dreams, soft and steady like a heartbeat that wouldn't quiet down. And yet there was fear of what it meant, fear of crossing a line that should never be crossed. But love, even when denied, finds a way to exist. Sometimes it lives in the smallest gestures, a shared look, a soft word, a hand brushing past another too closely to be an accident, yet too gently to be called bold. There was no confession, no grand declaration. Just moments that built themselves quietly, layer upon layer, until it was no longer possible to pretend. When he smiled, something inside softened. When he turned away, something ached. It wasn't a fantasy, nor was it wrong in its essence. It was simply love born in a place the world would never understand. He became more than a figure in the household. He became a constant thought. The way he moved, the way he cared for everyone, the way he never raised his voice, all of it settled deeply, too deeply. Sometimes it felt as though he could sense every unspoken word, as if his silence held answers that could never be said aloud. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It came in something simple, a moment of shared quiet after a storm, when the air outside smelled of rain and the world felt cleansed. The house was dim, and he stood by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass. There was something about the way he looked then, tired, real, unguarded, that made everything inside finally break open. It wasn't about titles anymore. It wasn't about what was allowed. It was about the undeniable truth that sometimes the soul recognizes its match in the most unexpected person. He turned, and for a moment the world stopped moving. There was no touch, no words, just that gaze, full of everything both of us had tried to hide. In that silence, something was understood. A promise unspoken, yet more real than anything that had ever been said before. What began as comfort had turned into a warmth neither could name. It lived in quiet spaces and silent looks, in the rhythm of breath and the echo of understanding. It wasn't a love that asked for acceptance. It was a love that simply was patient, deep, and painfully real. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself. It just grows quietly, endlessly, until it becomes the only truth that remains. There comes a point when the heart begins to carry too many feelings pressed into silence. Too many glances turned away before they reveal too much. What began as comfort had turned into something harder to contain, and every moment spent near him became a quiet battle between what should be and what already was. The world would never understand this love. Maybe even the heart itself didn't. Yet it beat louder for him with every passing day. It started with guilt, the kind that crawls under the skin and whispers in the dark. Every thought of him carried a weight, a question of what was right, what was wrong, and why the heart didn't seem to care either way. There were nights when the mind tried to reason, tried to remind that love should have limits, but the heart doesn't listen to reason. It listens to rhythm, to memory, to the ache of wanting something that feels too real to ignore. His kindness made it worse. The gentle way he spoke, the way he seemed to see everything without judgment, it made the guilt sharper, but the desire deeper. He never crossed a line, yet everything about him felt dangerously close to it. A glance across the room would last a second too long. A word said softly would echo for hours. Even silence felt like a conversation neither dared to start. There was a night when the world outside was still, wrapped in the quiet of rain. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp. He was there, sitting in that familiar calm way, reading, unaware that every flicker of his eyes across the page stirred something that couldn't be contained anymore. The air between us changed that night, not with words, but with the heaviness of all the ones we didn't speak. Desire is not always loud. Sometimes it's in restraint, in the effort to stay still when everything inside is begging to move closer. There were moments when his hand brushed past mine, and the world seemed to pause. The warmth of that single touch would stay long after, leaving behind a trembling guilt that felt almost like devotion. The heart knew it shouldn't want this, but it also knew it couldn't stop. Days turned into nights that refused to end. Thoughts became shadows that followed everywhere. Every time he spoke, it felt like confession. Every time he looked away, it felt like punishment. There was no escape from it, the pull between fear and longing, between doing what was right and feeling what was real. He must have felt it too. There was a quiet awareness in him, a hesitation that spoke more than any words could. Sometimes he avoided being alone, as if distance could protect what had already been broken. Other times, his presence lingered too long, as though he couldn't bring himself to walk away either. That unspoken tug between us grew heavier each day, a silent storm that neither of us knew how to stop. The guilt was constant. It lived in every heartbeat, in every stolen glance, in every late night thought that ended with his name. But guilt has a strange way of becoming part of love when love itself feels forbidden. It doesn't disappear, it just blends in with the ache, turning every feeling into something sharp and beautiful. There was a moment when it all nearly broke. Words almost escaped, trembling on the edge of confession. The world outside was asleep, and in that quiet, his name felt too heavy on the tongue. He looked at me, then really looked, and in that gaze, everything was said without being spoken. The truth hung between us like fragile glass, ready to shatter with a single breath, but neither moved. Sometimes love survives not through action, but through restraint, and yet, even restraint could not erase what was already written in the soul. Every time he smiled, the heart forgot to be cautious. Every time he turned away, it remembered the weight of what could never be. Love and guilt lived side by side, each one feeding the other one soft, one sharp, both impossibly strong. Sleep became a stranger. Nights stretched long and restless, filled with memories of moments that never really happened, but somehow felt real. The mind played cruel tricks, replaying the sound of his laughter, the way his hand brushed against a sleeve, the warmth that lingered too long to be called accidental. It was torture, but also a kind of solace because even pain felt better than emptiness. The heart had stopped fighting by then. Guilt was still there, but it no longer won. What remained was something raw and wordless, a love that didn't ask for forgiveness, because it had already given everything it had to feel alive. The soul doesn't understand rules, it only understands connection, and that connection, as forbidden as it was, felt truer than anything the world could define. Every heartbeat carried the weight of right and wrong, but in the end, love carried both. The guilt, the desire, the silence, they became part of the same story, one that neither could rewrite, only endure. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought in the world outside, but in the quiet war between what the mind fears and what the heart already knows. And in that war, love, even the forbidden kind, always wins. It happened quietly, the way most irreversible things do. There wasn't a plan or moment of courage carefully chosen, just a breath that lasted too long, a look that didn't turn away, and suddenly everything that had been buried beneath fear began to rise. For so long, truth had lived in silence, pressed behind layers of guilt and hesitation. But the heart can only carry secrets for so long before they start spilling through the cracks. The air between us had changed long before that day. Every word felt weighted, every shared space charged with something unspoken. There were nights when the quiet was unbearable, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The ache of restraint had become its own language. Yet in that moment, when eyes finally met without turning away, it was as if the world stopped asking for permission. There was no right or wrong anymore, only the raw truth of what was real. He had always been gentle in his distance, careful with the boundaries that had once defined us. But that day, something in him broke too. Maybe it was the exhaustion of pretending. Maybe it was the weight of all those years of holding back. His voice was different, soft, uncertain, yet filled with a kind of desperation that felt like honesty. When he spoke, it wasn't to confess or to defend. It was simply to breathe out what the soul had carried too long. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden rush, just the quiet trembling of two hearts that could no longer hide behind fear. His eyes told the story before his words did, years of restraint, of guilt, of nights spent wondering if love could ever be wrong when it felt so right. And in that silence, something inside finally broke open. The truth had always been there, waiting patiently behind every glance, every hesitation. But that day, it stepped into the light. Every wall that had once kept us apart crumbled like it was never meant to stand. The fear that had once guarded every heartbeat began to fade, replaced by something deeper, peace, maybe, or the kind of surrender that only comes when there's nothing left to lose. The moment wasn't loud, but it was complete. It was as if the entire world exhaled with us, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this truth to be spoken. He reached out not in certainty, but in vulnerability. There was hesitation in the way his hand trembled, a silent question asking if this was real, if love was allowed to exist after so much silence. The answer didn't come in words. It came in the space between us, in the stillness that followed. In that instant, every unspoken thing became known. Every battle fought in secret, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer for strength, all of it melted into the simple truth that this was love, pure and unshaped by rules. The weight of guilt was still there, but it no longer felt heavy. It was part of the story, a shadow that had given depth to the light. What remained was clarity, the quiet understanding that love was never meant to live in hiding. It wasn't rebellion, it was surrender, not to temptation but to truth. After that, everything looked the same, yet nothing was. The house, the walls, the air, they all held the echo of that moment. Even silence carried warmth now, as if it knew what had been confessed within it. There was no need to speak of it again. Love had made itself known, and that was enough. He changed in small ways. His laughter came easier, his presence softer, no longer guarded by the fear of what might be seen. There were moments when his hand brushed past mine, no longer by accident, but by choice. The world outside would never understand, and maybe that was the point. This love didn't belong to the world, it belonged to the two souls who had found each other against every expectation. And though the fear of judgment lingered, it no longer held power. Love had stripped away everything false and left behind something honest, something sacred. For the first time, there was no pretending. No boundaries drawn by what others believed should be. Just two hearts, tired of silence, finally finding rest in each other's truth. He once said that some loves aren't chosen, they simply arrive, as if sent by something greater. That thought stayed because maybe that's what it was. Not a mistake, not defiance, just destiny wearing a different face, asking to be seen for what it was: real, painful, beautiful, and true. The world could call it anything it wanted. But in that moment, when honesty broke every wall between us, there was only love, not perfect, not easy, but undeniable. And sometimes that's all a heart ever needs to stay alive. When truth finally spoke, love answered. There was a time when love lived only in whispers tucked between moments, hidden in glances that dared not last too long. Every feeling had to be folded away, carefully, so no one could see the truth of it. Love had been a secret then, something fragile and dangerous, born in quiet corners of the heart where rules could not reach. It was not the kind of love the world would ever bless, and yet it grew steady and relentless, as if it had always been meant to. But nothing stays hidden forever. Time has a way of stripping away pretense, of forcing hearts to face what they've tried to bury. What was once whispered in fear began to ache for daylight. It wasn't about defiance or rebellion anymore, it was about honesty, about no longer pretending that something so real could be wrong. The years had softened him. The sharp edges of guilt that once haunted his eyes were replaced with quiet understanding. There was no longer hesitation in his touch, no longer apology in the way he looked at me. It wasn't boldness, it was peace. Love had stopped being a secret and started being a truth that simply existed. People could judge, the world could turn its back, but love doesn't wait for permission, it only asks for courage. The day everything changed wasn't marked by grand gestures or promises carved in gold. It was simple, almost ordinary. Morning light filled the room, and for the first time, there was no fear left between us. Every wound, every sleepless night, every battle fought in silence had led to this, a moment where love stood without shame. His hand reached for mine not in secrecy, but in certainty. That small gesture said everything words never could. It wasn't an easy road. There were days when the weight of judgment pressed hard, when the past echoed too loudly to ignore. People whispered, and their words carried the sting of something cruel and cold. But love has a way of making pain feel small. It teaches patience, the kind that holds steady through storms, that believes even when belief feels foolish. Every trial, every tear, became part of the story that made the love stronger. There were nights when memories of fear still returned, the early days of hiding, of pretending to be nothing more than what the world would allow. But now those memories no longer hurt. They became reminders of how far love had come, how much it had endured. Love had been tested in every way possible and had survived not because it was perfect, but because it refused to give up. He would sometimes look at me as though he still couldn't believe it was real, that after everything, we had reached a place where love could breathe freely. And in that gaze, there was something sacred. Not the thrill of forbidden longing anymore, but the quiet strength of something that had been earned. The love that had once trembled in the dark now stood steady in the light. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic ending, no effortless happiness waiting at the end of pain. It was real, carved out of patience and forgiveness, built through nights of doubt and days of faith. It was love in its truest form, flawed, human, and unbreakable. Every scar it carried only made it more beautiful, because it told the story of two hearts that refused to surrender to fear. When love finally stepped into the open, there was no applause, no celebration. Just peace, the kind that fills the chest so completely that it feels like breathing for the first time. The world didn't need to understand. Love had found its own definition, one written not by others, but by the souls who lived it. There was something eternal about that surrender, not the kind promised in stories, but the kind that grows quietly over time, rooted in acceptance and truth. To love like that is to let go not of the past, not of pain, but of the need to hide. To stand beside the one who was once only a secret and see finally that the fight had been worth it. Love that had once been whispered in shame became a vow in dale, not spoken loudly, but lived softly every day, in the way eyes met without fear, in the way hands found each other without hesitation. It wasn't about breaking rules anymore, it was about rewriting them, about proving that love, when real, is stronger than judgment, deeper than shame, and more lasting than fear. And in that truth, in that quiet surrender, there was forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real and deep love stories where every ending isn't the end, but the beginning of forever.